The neighborhood of Ridgewood Pines had always carried the reputation of being one of the most orderly and well-controlled communities in the entire county. Perfect rows of identical houses lined the wide streets, every lawn trimmed to the exact height recommended in the neighborhood guidelines. The sidewalks were always clean, the trees were evenly spaced, and every mailbox looked like it had been measured with a ruler before it was installed. Behind this appearance of perfection stood the Homeowners Association that governed every corner of the neighborhood. The HOA board had spent years building a reputation for strict enforcement of its rules. Paint colors had to be approved. Fence heights had to meet exact measurements. Even the style of flower pots on front porches could be questioned if they did not match the approved aesthetic of the community. For most residents, it was easier to comply than to argue. People learned quickly that challenging the HOA often meant months of letters, warnings, and sometimes fines that slowly stacked up until they became impossible to ignore. Over time, the board had grown confident in its authority, and many of its members believed their job was to maintain absolute control over how the neighborhood looked. At the edge of this perfectly arranged suburb lived a homeowner named Daniel Carter. His property sat slightly apart from the others, near a strip of land where the neighborhood met a wooded utility corridor that stretched across the county. Unlike many residents in Ridgewood Pines, Daniel had lived there long before the community expanded and the HOA gained influence. His house was older than most of the others, a modest structure that had survived years of development around it. Daniel worked in telecommunications infrastructure, a field that most of his neighbors barely understood. His job involved maintaining network lines that connected small towns and suburban areas to the broader fiber backbone that powered internet services across the region. It was a career built on technical knowledge, careful planning, and constant maintenance of equipment that most people never noticed. The nature of his work often required odd hours. Sometimes he left before sunrise to inspect equipment along rural lines. Other times he returned home late at night after fixing unexpected outages. Despite the unpredictable schedule, Daniel preferred the quiet life his property offered. For years, his home existed peacefully beside the expanding neighborhood. The HOA occasionally sent routine reminders about trimming shrubs or updating paint, but nothing ever escalated into serious conflict. Daniel mostly kept to himself, focusing on his work and maintaining his small piece of land the way he saw fit. That quiet balance changed the day a bright orange cable appeared along the edge of his yard. The cable itself was not something unusual in Daniel's world. In fact, it was a temporary high-visibility conduit used during the installation and rerouting of underground fiber lines. Bright orange was the industry-standard color for telecommunications infrastructure. It existed for one simple reason: visibility. Workers needed to easily identify the cable, while construction crews, landscapers, and property owners could instantly recognize that it served a critical purpose. The line had been installed as part of a county infrastructure upgrade project that aimed to reinforce the main trunk connections serving several nearby towns. A section of older underground conduit had been damaged during heavy storms months earlier, forcing engineers to reroute part of the network temporarily while permanent repairs were scheduled. Daniel had been assigned to supervise the maintenance of that temporary connection. The cable ran from a utility box near the wooded corridor across a narrow strip at the edge of his property and continued underground toward the central trunk hub located several miles away. It was not permanent, but it was essential. For weeks, the cable sat quietly where it had been placed. It rested near the property line, clearly marked with small warning flags that indicated utility infrastructure. Most residents drove past it without paying attention. But one afternoon, the cable caught the attention of someone who cared deeply about appearances. A member of the HOA board happened to pass Daniel's property while conducting what the association called a neighborhood visual inspection. These inspections were part of their effort to ensure every property complied with the community's appearance guidelines. From the road, the bright orange cable stood out sharply against the green grass and carefully maintained lawns surrounding it. To someone unfamiliar with utility infrastructure, it looked strange, almost like a construction remnant that had been forgotten. The board member made a note immediately. Within a few days, a formal letter arrived in Daniel's mailbox. The envelope carried the familiar HOA letterhead that many residents recognized with a mixture of annoyance and resignation. Inside, the notice described a violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The document stated that an unsightly orange cable was visible along the edge of Daniel's property and that it disrupted the visual harmony of the community. The letter instructed him to remove the cable within 7 days or face escalating fines for non-compliance. For Daniel, the letter felt almost absurd. He understood that most people in the neighborhood probably had no idea what the cable actually was, but the situation was not something he could simply change to satisfy a visual preference. The cable was part of a critical temporary reroute approved by the county utilities department. Removing it without authorization would not just break a rule, it would risk damaging infrastructure that served thousands of people. At first, Daniel assumed the issue would resolve itself quickly. He contacted the HOA office and submitted documentation showing that the cable was part of an approved county project. The paperwork included permits, infrastructure diagrams, and official notices from the telecommunications company responsible for the installation. From Daniel's perspective, the matter was straightforward. Once the board understood the purpose of the cable, they would likely mark it as an exception until the permanent underground repair was completed. But the HOA board had a different perspective. Within Ridgewood Pines, the board members had grown accustomed to enforcing rules without much resistance. Their authority had rarely been questioned, and most residents simply complied when a violation notice appeared. The presence of an orange cable running along the edge of a lawn clashed with everything they believed the neighborhood represented. To them, it was not infrastructure. It was an eyesore that threatened the carefully maintained image of the community. When Daniel's documentation arrived, the board reviewed it briefly. Some members believed the explanation sounded reasonable. Others felt the cable still violated the HOA's strict visual standards. In the end, the board decided that the neighborhood rules should take priority. Another letter arrived a week later. This time, the tone was firmer. The notice stated that the HOA did not recognize the cable as an acceptable structure under the neighborhood guidelines. It repeated the demand that the cable be removed or relocated immediately. The document also included a warning that daily fines would begin if the cable remained visible after the deadline. Daniel read the letter with growing frustration. The board's response made it clear that they had ignored the technical explanation entirely. From their perspective, the cable was simply something they did not want to see. What concerned Daniel more was the possibility that the HOA might try to enforce the removal themselves. In many neighborhoods, HOA boards had limited authority over private property, but Ridgewood Pines had a long history of aggressive enforcement tactics. Still, Daniel believed common sense would eventually prevail. The cable was clearly marked. It was part of a county-approved project. Surely no one would interfere with something so obviously connected to utility infrastructure. For several days, nothing happened. The orange cable remained where it was, quietly performing its role in the network that connected homes, businesses, and government services across the region. But behind the scenes, the HOA board had begun discussing a different approach. Some members argued that if the homeowner refused to comply with the violation notice, the association had the right to correct the issue directly. Others suggested hiring a contractor to remove what they believed was an unauthorized installation. The conversation slowly shifted from enforcement to action, and somewhere in those discussions one simple but dangerous assumption took hold. The board convinced itself that the orange cable was just a cosmetic nuisance. They believed removing it would solve a visual problem. They had no idea that the cable they were planning to cut was connected to one of the most important trunk lines serving the entire county. And within a few days, their decision would set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the quiet streets of Ridgewood Pines. The consequences of that choice were already forming quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when someone decided to act. That moment was closer than anyone in the neighborhood realized, and once it arrived, the calm appearance of Ridgewood Pines would begin to unravel in ways no HOA board meeting could possibly control. The days following the second notice from the Homeowners Association unfolded with a quiet tension that most of the neighborhood barely noticed. To the outside observer, Ridgewood Pines still looked like the same carefully maintained suburb it had always been. Lawns remained trimmed with near-perfect precision, flower beds were freshly watered, and the quiet streets carried the calm rhythm of daily suburban life. But beneath that calm surface, a small conflict had begun to grow. Daniel Carter had already submitted every document he could think of to explain the purpose of the bright orange cable that ran along the edge of his property. The paperwork clearly outlined the county infrastructure project, the emergency rerouting plan, and the temporary nature of the installation. It also included diagrams showing how the line connected to a much larger network that served thousands of homes and businesses across the region. From Daniel's perspective, the situation should have ended there. Utility infrastructure projects often required temporary installations, and those installations were protected under county and state regulations. In most cases, homeowners associations understood that they had no authority over active utility lines. But the HOA board at Ridgewood Pines had spent years operating under a different mindset. Their authority had rarely been challenged, and their focus on visual uniformity had gradually grown into an obsession. To them, the neighborhood was not just a place where people lived, it was a carefully controlled environment where every visible detail had to match the image they believed the community deserved. The orange cable violated that image. During their weekly board meeting, the cable quickly became the center of discussion. Several members expressed frustration that the homeowner had ignored the original notice. Others argued that allowing such a visible installation would set a dangerous precedent. If one resident could place bright utility lines across their lawn, what would stop others from installing things that disrupted the neighborhood's appearance? The conversation slowly shifted away from the technical explanation Daniel had provided. Instead, the board focused on the idea that the cable had appeared without their approval. From their perspective, that alone was enough to justify action. Some members briefly questioned whether the cable truly belonged to a county project, but those concerns were quickly brushed aside. The board had grown accustomed to believing that their rules held authority over nearly every situation within the neighborhood boundaries. The more they discussed the issue, the more confident they became that the solution was simple. If the homeowner refused to remove the cable, the association would do it themselves. A vote was held near the end of the meeting. Within minutes, the board approved a plan to hire a local landscaping contractor to remove the cable from the property line. The task was described in the meeting notes as the removal of unauthorized exterior material interfering with neighborhood standards. None of the board members had any technical knowledge about telecommunications infrastructure. To them, the bright orange cable looked no different from a temporary construction line that had been forgotten after a project. And because of that assumption, the decision felt harmless. The contractor was contacted the following day. The landscaping company had worked with the HOA before. Their usual tasks involved trimming trees, repairing sidewalks, or removing small structures that violated the community's guidelines. When they received the request to remove a cable along the edge of a lawn, the job seemed unusual but not particularly complicated. A crew was scheduled for the following morning. At the same time, Daniel was several miles away, working along another section of the county's fiber network. His job that day involved inspecting junction boxes along a rural stretch of highway that connected several smaller towns to the primary trunk line. While he worked, the temporary cable running across his property continued doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It carried data across a rerouted section of the network, quietly bridging the gap left by the damaged underground conduit that engineers were still preparing to repair permanently. Thousands of internet connections depended on that reroute, but none of the people making decisions in the Ridgewood Pines boardroom had any idea how critical that temporary line actually was. The following morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of quiet suburban calm that made the neighborhood look almost frozen in time. Residents left for work, children boarded school buses, and the usual morning routines unfolded across the streets. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a small truck from the landscaping company pulled into the neighborhood. Two workers stepped out and reviewed the job description on their clipboard. The instructions were simple: remove the orange cable along the property line at the specified address. When they arrived at Daniel's property, the cable was easy to spot. It ran across the edge of the grass exactly as the HOA had described. Bright orange insulation covered the thick line, and small warning flags stood nearby, marking it as utility infrastructure. The workers paused for a moment. They had seen similar cables before during road construction projects and utility work. The bright color was a common indicator that the line served a technical purpose. But their job order came directly from the Homeowners Association, and the instructions were clear. From their perspective, they were simply following a removal request from the property management authority responsible for the neighborhood. One of the workers retrieved a pair of heavy-duty cutters from the truck. The cable itself was thicker than typical residential wiring, but the tool was designed to handle tough materials. The worker positioned the cutters around the bright orange insulation and applied pressure. For a moment, the blades resisted. Then they snapped through the line. The cut happened in a single sharp motion that felt almost insignificant. But miles away, inside a quiet network monitoring facility operated by the county's telecommunications provider, a series of alarms began flashing across several computer screens. Engineers monitoring the system watched as data traffic across one section of the network suddenly dropped to zero. At first, the disruption looked like a temporary glitch. Networks often experience minor fluctuations due to weather conditions or routine maintenance. But within seconds, additional alerts began appearing. The monitoring system showed that the temporary reroute carrying traffic across the damaged conduit had been severed completely. The trunk connection feeding several towns had lost its bridge. Without that connection, the network began automatically attempting to reroute traffic through secondary paths. Unfortunately, those backup routes were not designed to carry the full load of the disrupted trunk line. Within minutes, internet speeds across the county began slowing dramatically. Businesses experienced connection failures. Phone services that relied on digital infrastructure started dropping calls. Emergency dispatch centers noticed delays in data transmission between departments. The ripple effects spread quickly. At Daniel's property, the landscaping crew rolled up the remaining section of cable and loaded it into their truck, satisfied that they had completed the task exactly as requested. To them, the job had been quick and uneventful. They drove away without realizing that the small piece of cable sitting in the back of their truck had been the only bridge holding together a critical section of the county's telecommunications network. Meanwhile, across offices, schools, hospitals, and homes, people began noticing that their internet connections had suddenly gone dark. For the engineers monitoring the outage, the situation was becoming increasingly urgent. They traced the disruption back through the network logs, following the sudden signal loss through a chain of nodes and junction points. Eventually, the system identified the exact location where the connection had disappeared. The coordinates pointed directly to a small residential neighborhood called Ridgewood Pines, and the moment Daniel Carter's phone buzzed with an emergency alert from the network monitoring system, he realized something had gone terribly wrong. The alert that appeared on Daniel Carter's phone was the kind that never arrived without a serious reason. In the telecommunications industry, automated monitoring systems constantly tracked the health of network connections across every major line. Most alerts involved small disturbances, temporary latency spikes, brief signal degradation, or localized outages that could usually be resolved within minutes. But the notification Daniel received was different. The system had flagged a critical trunk disruption. For anyone unfamiliar with the structure of a telecommunications network, the term might have sounded technical but harmless. In reality, a trunk line served as the backbone of an entire region's connectivity. It carried massive volumes of data between major network hubs and redistributed that traffic to smaller local lines, feeding homes, businesses, schools, hospitals, and emergency services. When a trunk line failed, the consequences spread quickly. Daniel immediately opened the monitoring application and examined the diagnostic report. The system had already begun rerouting traffic through secondary pathways, but those routes were designed only for temporary overloads. They could not sustain the volume of data normally handled by the primary connection. Within minutes, the system logs began filling with cascading alerts: signal loss, connection failures, regional service interruptions, and at the center of it all was the reroute cable Daniel had personally supervised weeks earlier. The orange cable running across the edge of his property. Daniel stared at the map on his screen. The system displayed the exact coordinates where the signal had been severed. The blinking red marker sat precisely on the small strip of land beside his house. A deep sense of unease settled over him. There was only one explanation. Someone had cut the line. Without hesitation, Daniel packed his equipment and drove back toward Ridgewood Pines. The normally quiet rural roads suddenly felt longer than usual. As he drove, his phone continued vibrating with incoming notifications from the Network Operations Center. Engineers across the system were already scrambling to identify the cause of the outage. But Daniel had a strong suspicion he already knew. The second HOA notice had warned that the association might take action if the cable remained in place. At the time, he had dismissed the idea as unlikely. No one would seriously attempt to remove marked telecommunications infrastructure. Yet the blinking red marker on the monitoring map told a different story. By the time Daniel reached the entrance of Ridgewood Pines, the scale of the disruption was already becoming visible. Several residents stood outside their homes, staring down at their phones, confused by the sudden loss of internet service. Others attempted to restart their routers or check their network connections. To most of them, it looked like a routine outage. But Daniel knew the situation was far more serious. He pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the truck. His eyes immediately moved toward the edge of the property where the cable had been installed. The bright orange line was gone. Only a short section of torn insulation remained near the ground, the clean cut clearly visible where heavy cutters had snapped through the thick cable. The warning flags marking the utility installation had been tossed aside, some lying flat against the grass. For a moment, Daniel simply stood there, absorbing what had happened. The line that had carried a critical reroute for the county's network had been treated like an unwanted extension cord, and now it was gone. His phone rang again, this time displaying the number of the Regional Network Operations Center. The engineers there were already deep into emergency diagnostics. Their monitoring systems had traced the failure to the exact location Daniel was standing. They needed confirmation of the physical damage so they could begin organizing repair crews. Daniel documented the scene quickly. He photographed the cut cable, the removed sections, and the disturbed ground around the installation area. Every detail mattered. When infrastructure failures occurred, the cause had to be carefully recorded, especially if external interference was involved. Within minutes, a full outage report was opened in the system. The consequences of the damage were growing by the hour. Across the county, businesses began reporting service interruptions that disrupted payment systems and digital operations. Schools that relied on online platforms struggled to maintain their schedules. Medical facilities experienced slow data transfers between departments, forcing staff to temporarily rely on manual procedures. Emergency services faced even greater complications. Dispatch centers depended on stable communication networks to coordinate responses across multiple districts. The sudden instability forced them to activate contingency protocols designed for large-scale infrastructure failures. Meanwhile, the Homeowners Association board at Ridgewood Pines had no idea what they had triggered. The landscaping crew had already submitted their completion report earlier that morning. According to their records, the job had been simple. They had removed a bright orange cable from the edge of a lawn as instructed. To them, the work order had been routine. But by early afternoon, unusual signs began appearing across the neighborhood. Residents noticed their internet connections had not returned after the usual restart attempts. Streaming services stopped loading. Smart home systems disconnected from their networks. Even mobile data speeds slowed as local cell towers struggled to reroute traffic through overloaded backup channels. Frustration spread quickly among the residents. Some blamed the service provider. Others assumed construction crews somewhere nearby had accidentally damaged a line. Inside the HOA office, the board members continued their normal operations, unaware that the cable they had ordered removed was the exact point where the county's network had collapsed. That illusion ended when several large service vehicles began entering the neighborhood. Telecommunications repair trucks, marked with bright company logos and heavy equipment racks, rolled slowly down the street toward Daniel's property. Behind them came county utility vehicles and a mobile operations van used during major infrastructure incidents. Residents watched from their windows as the convoy arrived. Within minutes, technicians began inspecting the damaged site. They measured the severed line, examined the cut ends, and confirmed what Daniel already knew. The trunk reroute had been completely destroyed. Repairing the damage would not be simple. Temporary fiber connections required specialized equipment and careful alignment. The cable had not only been cut, sections of it had been removed entirely. Restoring service would require reconstructing the connection from scratch. As the technicians worked, word of the situation began spreading through the operations center and county infrastructure offices. The outage was no longer considered a technical malfunction. It was being classified as external interference with critical telecommunications infrastructure. That classification triggered a different kind of response. Legal departments were notified. Incident investigators were assigned, and for the first time since the cable had been cut that morning, attention turned toward the question of responsibility. Back at the HOA office, the board members were still discussing routine neighborhood matters when the first official inquiry arrived. A representative from the telecommunications company requested immediate information regarding any construction or maintenance activities authorized by the association that day. The board members reviewed the request with mild confusion. Then someone remembered the landscaping order. At first it seemed like a coincidence, but as more service vehicles filled the street near Daniel's property and technicians continued working around the damaged site, the board slowly began realizing that the orange cable they had ordered removed might not have been a harmless eyesore after all. What they still did not understand was the full scale of the consequences, because by that point, the outage had already spread across the entire county, and the investigation into how it happened had only just begun. The investigation into the county-wide outage moved quickly once the telecommunications provider confirmed that the trunk reroute had been deliberately cut. Incidents involving accidental damage were common in infrastructure work, especially during construction or excavation projects. However, this situation was different. The cable had not been damaged by heavy machinery or buried beneath collapsed soil. It had been cleanly severed and removed. That detail immediately changed how the situation was treated. By late afternoon, technicians had already begun assembling a temporary emergency splice to restore partial connectivity, but rebuilding the reroute line would take hours. The network engineers worked methodically, carefully aligning the fiber strands and reconnecting signal pathways that carried massive amounts of digital traffic across the county. As they worked, investigators documented everything. They photographed the clean cut through the cable, measured the missing segments, and examined the warning markers that had originally surrounded the installation. The bright flags clearly labeled the area as telecommunications infrastructure, and small tags attached to the cable itself identified it as part of an active utility reroute. There was no question that the line had been marked, which meant the next question became unavoidable. Who had ordered it removed? The answer surfaced quickly once the landscaping company was contacted. Their work order came directly from the Ridgewood Pines Homeowners Association. The request described the cable as an unauthorized exterior installation that violated neighborhood appearance standards. The moment investigators read that description, the situation took another serious turn. Interfering with active telecommunications infrastructure was not a minor matter. Federal and state regulations classified such interference as damage to critical infrastructure, especially when the damage caused large-scale service disruptions. And the outage that day had affected far more than a single neighborhood. Across the county, internet service had slowed or collapsed entirely for thousands of homes. Businesses had been forced to suspend digital operations. Schools struggled to maintain online systems. Hospitals had temporarily shifted certain data transfers to backup networks. Emergency services had experienced delays that required contingency communication procedures. All of it traced back to the single cut cable running across Daniel Carter's property. By early evening, most of the county's connectivity had been restored through temporary rerouting and emergency splicing, but the damage report continued growing as service providers assessed the full scope of the disruption. Meanwhile, inside the HOA office, the board members sat in a meeting room that suddenly felt far smaller than it had earlier that morning. At first, they had believed the outage might be unrelated to their actions, but as investigators requested documentation, contractor records, and meeting minutes, it became impossible to deny the connection. The landscaping work order had been signed by the HOA board. They had approved the removal of the cable, and the cable had been part of a critical network reroute. The board members slowly began realizing the gravity of what had happened. What they had dismissed as an aesthetic nuisance had turned out to be a vital component of the county's telecommunications infrastructure. The quiet confidence they once carried during their meetings began fading as legal implications surfaced. Telecommunications companies operated under strict regulatory protections because their networks supported essential public services. Any unauthorized interference could result in serious financial liability. And the damage from a county-wide outage was not small. Repair crews had been deployed from multiple districts. Emergency network engineers had worked for hours to stabilize connections. Businesses had lost revenue during the disruption, and several government departments had documented operational delays caused by the outage. Every one of those costs was now being compiled into a formal incident report. Daniel Carter watched much of the aftermath unfold from the edge of his property as technicians continued repairing the network line. The temporary emergency connection restored most services by late evening, but the permanent repair would require several days of careful reconstruction. Despite the chaos surrounding the outage, Daniel himself had remained calm throughout the process. He had already documented his communications with the HOA, including the permits and infrastructure diagrams he had submitted before the cable was removed. From his perspective, the situation had been completely avoidable. If the HOA board had simply contacted the county utilities department or the telecommunications provider, they would have learned exactly what the cable was. The entire conflict could have ended with a brief explanation. Instead, the board had assumed their authority extended to anything visible within the neighborhood. That assumption had now collided with the reality of infrastructure law. Within days, formal notices began arriving at the Ridgewood Pines HOA office. The telecommunications company submitted an initial claim outlining the cost of repairs, emergency labor, and equipment deployment. County officials opened a regulatory review, examining whether the association had violated protections governing public utility infrastructure. Legal teams became involved almost immediately. The landscaping contractor, who had simply followed the HOA's instructions, provided a full record of the work order and communication with the association. Those documents clearly showed that the decision to remove the cable originated from the board's enforcement action. For the first time in years, the Homeowners Association found itself in a position where its authority meant very little. The laws protecting telecommunications infrastructure existed far beyond neighborhood rulebooks. Over the following weeks, the financial consequences became clear. The cost of restoring the trunk reroute, compensating emergency crews, and repairing the damaged infrastructure climbed into a figure that stunned the association's leadership. Insurance policies were reviewed, legal responsibilities were examined, and negotiations began over how the damages would be paid. Within the neighborhood itself, the story spread quickly. Residents who had once supported the HOA's strict enforcement policies began questioning how such a serious mistake could happen. Many homeowners had joined the association believing it would maintain property values and neighborhood order. Now they were learning that the board's actions had triggered one of the largest infrastructure outages the county had experienced in years. The incident forced a dramatic shift within the community. Several board members resigned in the weeks following the investigation. New elections were held, bringing in leadership that approached neighborhood governance with far more caution than their predecessors. The association also adopted a new policy requiring verification with county utilities before taking action against any structure that might involve infrastructure or public services. It was a lesson learned the hard way. For Daniel Carter, life gradually returned to normal once the permanent trunk reroute was installed and the temporary cable removed properly by authorized technicians. The bright orange line that had caused so much controversy disappeared once the underground conduit was repaired and service fully stabilized. The edge of his property looked exactly the way the HOA had wanted from the beginning. But the neighborhood itself had changed. The residents of Ridgewood Pines had witnessed firsthand how a small decision made for the sake of appearances could ripple far beyond a quiet suburban street. The orange cable that once seemed like an inconvenience had turned out to be a critical link connecting thousands of people to the digital world they depended on every day. And the Homeowners Association that once believed it controlled every detail of the neighborhood had discovered that some things existed far outside the boundaries of their rulebook. In the end, the lesson was simple but unforgettable. Sometimes the things people consider the smallest inconveniences are actually the threads holding far larger systems together. And cutting those threads can unravel far more than anyone expects. If you want to see the shocking twist and how she got revenge, hit subscribe and don't miss the next HOA story. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.